Sometimes love finds you when you least expect it, wrapped in trail dust and carrying everything it owns in worn saddlebags. Sometimes it finds you when you've given up believing in it altogether, when your heart has been trampled by so many boots you're certain it'll never beat properly again. In 1884 in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, Jack Mountain McKenzie stood 6 feet and 10 inches of pure contradiction. A gentle giant whose massive hands could craft furniture delicate as lace or break a man's jaw with equal ease. His shoulders filled door frames, his presence commanded rooms, yet children flocked to him like he was made of candy and Christmas morning. Rose Catherine O'Malley had been working the Silver Dollar Saloon for 3 years, serving drinks and deflecting advances with the practiced ease of a woman who'd learned early that survival meant staying one step ahead of disappointment. At 24, she possessed a sharp wit, sharper tongue, and the kind of beauty that made men stupid. Auburn hair that caught lamplight like fire, emerald eyes that missed nothing, and curves that her modest saloon dress couldn't quite conceal. When Jack walked through those batwing doors that October evening and made his impossible promise, 1 year to make her forget every man before him, he had no way of knowing he was staking his claim on the most guarded heart in 3 territories. But what happens when a woman who's sworn off love meets a man determined to prove her wrong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Rose Catherine O'Malley laid eyes on Jack McKenzie, she was wiping whiskey off her apron and cursing under her breath at Ned Hawkins, who'd gotten too friendly with his hands again. The October wind was rattling the Silver Dollar's windows something fierce, and the last thing she needed was another drifter looking for trouble. But Jack wasn't looking for trouble. He was trouble, standing there in the doorway like he'd been carved from the mountains themselves. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at his collar, and his eyes were the color of pine forests after rain. He wore his clothes like a man comfortable in his own skin, worn leather chaps over denim that had seen honest work, a flannel shirt that stretched across shoulders broad enough to carry the world's sorrows. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying the kind of deep rumble that made glasses vibrate on the bar. He removed his hat, revealing more of that unruly dark hair, and Rose noticed calluses on his hands that spoke of years working with wood and iron. "We're full up on rooms if that's what you're after," Rose said automatically, not bothering to look up from cleaning her apron. She'd learned long ago that eye contact was an invitation most men couldn't resist accepting. "Not looking for a room, miss. Looking for work." That made her glance up. His eyes weren't like the others, hungry, calculating, full of assumptions about what she was selling. They were respectful, patient, like he had all the time in the world to wait for whatever she might choose to offer. "Barkeep's over there," she said, nodding toward old Pete behind the mahogany bar. "Though I doubt he's hiring. Most folks are closing up shop for winter, not expanding." Jack nodded his thanks, but didn't move toward the bar immediately. Instead, he studied the saloon with the eye of a craftsman, taking in the worn batwing doors that hung slightly crooked, the tables with legs that wobbled, the bar rail that had come loose at one end. "Lot of good bones in this place," he said, almost to himself. "Just needs someone to care for her properly." Something in his tone made Rose look at him again. Really look. Most men who came through those doors saw only what they could take. Her attention, her time, sometimes more if they had enough coin and whiskey courage. This man saw what he could give. "You a carpenter?" she asked. "Among other things." He moved toward the bar then, but slowly, like he understood that sudden movements made people nervous. "Jack McKenzie," he said, extending his hand to old Pete. "Pete Kowalski. And you'd be right about those bones. This place has seen better days. But I can't afford to pay much for repairs." "Didn't say anything about payment," Jack replied. "Said I was looking for work. Room and board would suit me fine, and I can see plenty that needs doing." Rose found herself drifting closer, drawn by curiosity and something else she couldn't name. In her 3 years at the Silver Dollar, she'd watched men negotiate everything from card games to cattle deals, but she'd never heard anyone offer to work for free. "What's the catch?" Pete asked, voicing what Rose was thinking. Jack's smile was slow and genuine. "No catch. Winter's coming, and I need a place to weather it. Figured I might as well be useful while I'm here." "You running from something?" This from Rose, sharp and suspicious. She'd learned to smell trouble on a man, and while Jack didn't carry the usual markers, shifty eyes, nervous hands, the quick glances that spoke of guilty consciences, she'd been wrong before. Jack turned those forest green eyes on her fully for the first time, and Rose felt something flutter in her chest that she'd thought died years ago. Not running from anything, miss. Running towards something, maybe, but that's different. Running toward what? Haven't figured that out yet. Pete was already nodding. Room above the stable's yours if you want it. Not much, just 4 walls and a roof. But it's dry and warm enough. That'll do fine. Jack shook Pete's hand, sealing the deal. I'll start tomorrow if that suits. As Jack headed for the door, Rose found herself calling after him. I didn't catch your name. He turned back, that slow smile spreading across his face again. Jack McKenzie, miss. And you'd be? Rose. She didn't offer her last name. Hadn't used it in so long she sometimes forgot she had one. Well then, Rose, I reckon we'll be seeing plenty of each other. He settled his hat back on his head, tipping it slightly. Good evening. After he left, the saloon felt different somehow. Smaller. Like his presence had filled spaces she hadn't realized were empty. That's a big man, Pete observed, polishing a glass with practiced efficiency. Big men cause big trouble, Rose replied automatically, but her heart wasn't in it. She kept thinking about Jack's hands, scarred and calloused from honest work, but gentle when he'd removed his hat. And his eyes, which had looked at her like she was a person instead of a commodity. Not all of them, Pete said quietly. My Sarah, God rest her soul, she always said you could tell a man's character by how he treats things that are broken. That one looks at this place like he wants to fix it, not tear it down. Rose didn't answer, but Pete's words followed her through the rest of her shift. She found herself glancing toward the window, wondering what Jack was doing in that room above the stable, whether he was looking out at the same stars she could see reflected in the saloon's mirror. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of bite in the air that promised winter wasn't far off. Rose arrived early to help Pete prepare for the day, and found Jack already at work, replacing the leather hinges on the batwing doors. He'd shed his flannel shirt in favor of a cotton undershirt that revealed arms corded with muscle and decorated with small scars, badges of a life lived working with his hands. Curls of wood shaving littered the ground around his boots, and the sharp, clean scent of pine hung in the air. Morning, he said without looking up from his work. You're up early. Light's best in the morning. And these doors have been hanging crooked so long they've worn grooves in the wrong places. Easier to fix now before winter sets in proper. Rose watched him work, mesmerized despite herself by the careful precision of his movements. His massive hands moved with surprising delicacy, adjusting hinges with the kind of patience that spoke of a man who understood that good work couldn't be rushed. You do this professionally? She asked. Did. Had a shop back in Missouri for a while. Made furniture mostly. Tables, chairs, bed frames. Things people need. He paused in his work to test the door's swing. Satisfying work, making something useful with your hands. What happened to it? Jack's hands stilled for a moment, and Rose caught a glimpse of something dark crossing his features. Fire, he said simply. Lost everything in one night. I'm sorry. He shrugged, the movement rippling through his broad shoulders. Things have a way of working out. Losing that shop is what brought me here, and I'm starting to think that might not be such a bad thing after all. There was something in his tone, a warmth that made Rose's cheeks heat. She busied herself sweeping the front steps, trying to ignore the way her pulse had picked up. Rose. Jack's voice stopped her mid-sweep. Can I ask you something? She tensed automatically. Here it comes, she thought. The proposition, the assumption, the moment when he revealed he was just like all the rest. How long have you been here? In Silver Creek, I mean. Not what she'd expected. 3 years. You like it? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before, whether she liked it here, whether she was happy. Men asked if she was busy, if she was available, if she was interested. Never if she was content. She struggled for words. It's safe. Jack nodded as if that answer told him everything he needed to know. Safe's important, but it's not everything. Before Rose could ask what he meant by that, Pete emerged from the saloon, coffee cup in hand, and approval written all over his weathered features. Doors look good, son. Been meaning to fix those for months. Just getting started, Jack replied. That bar rail's next. and the stairs to the second floor could use some attention before someone breaks their neck. As the days passed, Jack proved true to his word. He worked steadily and without complaint, transforming the silver dollar from a tired, worn-down establishment into something approaching its former glory. He reinforced wobbly tables, replaced broken floorboards, and crafted new shutters for the windows that kept out the increasingly bitter wind. But it wasn't just the physical repairs that were changing the place. Jack's presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the saloon. Fights broke out less frequently. Maybe because nobody wanted to start trouble with the giant who'd proven he could lift a full-grown man off his feet with one hand. The regular customers began lingering longer, drawn by the warmth of the improved space and the quiet authority Jack projected without ever saying a word. Rose found herself watching him work, fascinated by the transformation happening around her. She'd grown so accustomed to the saloon's shabby state that she'd stopped seeing it, stopped imagining it could be anything more than what it was. But Jack saw potential everywhere, in warped boards that could be planed straight, in tarnished brass that could be polished to shine, in broken things that could be made whole again. "You're staring." Rose jerked her attention back to the present, realizing she'd been watching Jack repair a chair leg while completely ignoring the customer trying to order a beer. "Sorry, Charlie," she said, grabbing a mug and filling it from the tap. "What were you saying?" Charlie Brennan, one of the local ranchers, grinned and tipped his hat. "I was saying that big fellow's been causing quite a stir around town. Word is he arm-wrestled Bull McKenna into submission over at the general store yesterday." Rose glanced toward Jack, who was testing the stability of the newly repaired chair. "Bull started it, I'll bet." "That he did. Got mouthy about newcomers taking work from locals. Your carpenter there didn't say much, just rolled up his sleeves and settled it the old-fashioned way." Charlie chuckled. "Bull's been nursing his pride and a sore arm ever since." The news didn't surprise Rose. She'd watched Jack navigate the social dynamics of the saloon with the same careful precision he brought to his carpentry work. He didn't go looking for trouble, but he didn't back down from it either. Men respected that, even if they didn't always like it. "He's not my carpenter," Rose said automatically. "Course not," Charlie agreed, but his knowing smile suggested he thought otherwise. "Just seems like you two have been spending a fair amount of time talking. That's all." Had they? Rose tried to think back over the past week. Yes, she supposed they had talked, small conversations while she worked and he repaired things around her. Nothing improper, nothing that crossed the carefully maintained boundaries of her professional life. But there had been something comfortable about those exchanges, a ease she rarely felt with men. As if summoned by her thoughts, Jack approached the bar, chair in hand. "This one should hold now," he said to Pete. The joint was loose, but it's solid as a rock now. "You're a miracle worker," Pete replied. "Place hasn't looked this good in years." Jack's eyes found Rose's across the bar. Sometimes things just need someone to see their potential. The way he said it, looking directly at her, made Rose's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with furniture repair and everything to do with the quiet intensity in his green eyes. That evening, after the last customer had stumbled home and Pete had locked up for the night, Rose found herself lingering instead of heading to her small room behind the kitchen. Jack was still working, this time on the staircase, sanding down rough spots in the banister by lamplight. "You don't have to work so late," she said, settling into one of the recently repaired chairs. "Don't mind it. I like working with my hands, and it's peaceful here at night." Rose studied his profile in the golden lamplight. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, each stroke of the sandpaper deliberate and rhythmic. "What made you want to be a carpenter?" Jack paused, considering the question. "My grandfather, I suppose. He was a cabinet maker back in Pennsylvania. Made the most beautiful pieces you ever saw. Taught me that working with wood was like partnering with something alive. Each piece has its own grain, its own character. You can't force it to be something it's not, but if you're patient and respectful, it'll show you what it wants to become." Sounds almost spiritual. Maybe it is. Jack resumed his sanding. There's something satisfying about taking raw materials and creating something useful, something beautiful, something that'll outlast the man who made it. Rose found herself leaning forward, drawn by the passion in his voice. "Is that what you want? To be remembered? Don't we all?" Jack's hands stilled again. "I spent years in Missouri building furniture for other people's homes, other people's lives. Made some beautiful pieces, but when that fire came through..." He shook his head. Gone in one night. Made me realize that maybe I'd been building the wrong things. What should you have been building? Jack looked up from his work, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Something that matters. Something that can't be destroyed by fire or flood or time. Rose felt heat creep up her neck at the way he was looking at her, like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve, a piece of wood whose grain he was learning to read. And what would that be? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack set down his sandpaper and moved closer, his footsteps silent on the newly repaired floor. He stopped just close enough that Rose could smell sawdust and honest sweat, could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. A life, he said simply. A real life, with someone worth building it with. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Rose felt something unfurl in her chest, something she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. Hope, maybe, or possibility. Or maybe just the recognition that this man saw her as more than the sum of her mistakes. Rose. Jack's voice was gentle, careful. I know you don't know me well, and I know you've got reasons to be cautious. But I want you to know that when I look at you, I don't see what other men see. What do you see? The question slipped out before she could stop it. I see a woman who's stronger than she knows. Smart enough to survive in a world that hasn't been particularly kind to her. Beautiful, yes, but that's just the surface. Jack's massive hand reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, his fingers brushed her cheek with surprising gentleness. I see someone who's forgotten what it feels like to be cherished. Rose's eyes fluttered closed at his touch. When was the last time someone had touched her face like that? Like she was precious, fragile, worth protecting? Jack, she started, but he shook his head. You don't have to say anything. I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I'm just asking for a chance. A chance at what? Jack's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with reverent care. Give me 1 year, Rose. 1 year to show you that not all men are the same. 1 year to prove that you deserve to be loved properly, completely, without reservation or condition. Rose opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. And if I can't? If I'm too damaged, too broken? Then I'll love the broken pieces too, Jack said without hesitation. I'll love them until you remember how to love them yourself. The promise hung in the air between them, impossibly sweet and terrifying all at once. Rose had built her life around the certainty that men would disappoint her, that safety lay in keeping her heart locked away where it couldn't be reached or wounded. But Jack was asking her to unlock it, to trust him with the most fragile parts of herself. 1 year, she whispered. 1 year, Jack confirmed. Give me 1 year, and I'll make you forget every man before me ever existed. Rose's agreement to Jack's proposition changed something fundamental in the rhythm of their days. It wasn't that anything improper occurred. Jack was nothing if not a gentleman, maintaining respectful boundaries even as his presence seemed to fill every corner of Rose's awareness. But there was an undercurrent now, a shared understanding that they were moving toward something neither quite dared to name. November brought the first serious snow, blanketing Silver Creek in pristine white that made the world seem hushed and expectant. The Silver Dollar's repairs were nearly complete, transformed from a tired way station into something approaching elegance. Jack had crafted new tables from reclaimed timber, their surfaces smooth as silk under careful hands. The bar rail gleamed with fresh brass fittings, and the staircase no longer creaked ominous warnings with every step. But it was the small touches that made Rose's breath catch, hand-carved details in the chair backs that reminded her of wildflowers, a custom mirror frame that somehow made the lamplight dance more warmly, shutters fitted so precisely they kept out every whisper of winter wind. Each piece bore the mark of a craftsman who understood that beauty lay in both form and function, in creating things that served their purpose while lifting the spirit. You've been busy, Rose observed one morning, running her fingers along the intricate carving that decorated the new bar front. The design was subtle but unmistakable, intertwined roses and mountain laurel, symbols that spoke to anyone who cared to look closely. Jack glanced up from where he was installing the final brass fixture, a flush of satisfaction coloring his weathered features. Figured if I was going to be here a year, might as well make it a place worth being. The casual reference to their agreement sent warmth spiraling through Rose's chest. He spoke of it as a given, a settled fact that needed no further discussion. There was something profoundly reassuring about his certainty, as if he'd already seen their future and found it good. The townspeople have been talking, Rose said, settling into one of the new chairs with her morning coffee. Good things, I hope. Mostly. Rose smiled at his concerned expression. They're calling you Mountain Mackenzie now. Word is you helped the Patterson family shore up their barn roof before the storm hit, and Martha Stevens swears you fixed her broken porch swing without being asked. Jack shrugged, the movement rippling through shoulders that seemed to strain the seams of his flannel shirt. Neighbors help neighbors. That's how communities survive. Is that what we are to you? Community. The question slipped out before Rose could stop it, carrying more vulnerability than she'd intended. Jack set down his tools and gave her his full attention, those green eyes serious and steady. You're not community to me, Rose. You're. He paused, searching for words with the same care he brought to selecting the right piece of wood. You're the reason I want to build something lasting here. Before Rose could respond, the saloon doors burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and the unmistakable swagger of trouble. Silas Blackwood filled the doorway like a bad omen, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as Silver Creek's self-appointed aristocracy. Behind him came two men Rose recognized with sinking dread, Garrett Hayes and Tom Morrison, local toughs who did Blackwood's dirty work for whiskey money. Well, Blackwood drawled, his cold eyes taking in the transformed saloon with obvious displeasure. Heard the old place had gotten itself a handyman. Didn't realize it was someone so substantial. Jack straightened slowly, his massive frame unfolding with deceptive calm. Rose had seen him work, had watched those huge hands craft delicate details with infinite patience. But there was something different in his stance now, something that reminded her he could probably break a man in half if properly motivated. Something I can help you with. Jack's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made smart men reconsider their intentions. Actually, yes. Blackwood stepped further into the saloon, his boots clicking against the newly polished floor. I represent certain business interests in this town. Interests that are concerned about unauthorized improvements to commercial properties. Rose felt ice form in her stomach. She'd been dreading this moment since Jack's first repair, knowing that Blackwood had his fingers in every profitable enterprise within 50 miles of Silver Creek. The man had been circling the silver dollar like a vulture for months, waiting for Pete to fall behind on his mortgage payments. These improvements were made with the owner's permission, Jack said evenly. But that's where things get complicated. Blackwood produced a folded document from his coat, handling it with the reverence of a man who understood paper could be as deadly as bullets. You see, Mr. Kowalski's mortgage comes due at the end of the month. Given the enhanced value of the property, I'm afraid the bank will be calling in the full amount. Pete emerged from behind the bar, his weathered face pale with understanding. Silas, we've had an understanding. Business is business, Pete. Nothing personal. Blackwood's smile held all the warmth of a January blizzard. Of course, I might be willing to discuss alternative arrangements. For the right price. Rose watched Jack's jaw tighten, saw his hands curl slowly into fists. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of his moods over the past weeks, and what she saw now made her pulse quicken with something between fear and anticipation. What kind of arrangements? Pete asked, though Rose could tell from his tone that he already suspected the answer. Well, the property has certain assets that might offset the debt. Blackwood's gaze slid to Rose with unmistakable intent. I'm always in need of quality entertainment for my business associates. A woman of Miss O'Malley's obvious talents could prove quite valuable. The words hit Rose like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about Blackwood's intentions. She'd known men like him before. Men who saw women as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded. Men who believed money gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. Jack moved then, not quickly, but with the inevitable momentum of an avalanche. One moment he was standing by the bar, the next he was directly in front of Blackwood, his imposing frame blocking out the light. I think you'd better clarify that proposition, Jack said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Rose's skin prickle with awareness. Blackwood had the sense to take a step back, but his smile never wavered. Simple mathematics, really. The debt is significant, but Miss O'Malley's services over an agreed period could substantially reduce the amount owed. Rose felt something break inside her chest, some carefully maintained dam that had held back years of rage and humiliation. She'd endured countless propositions, endless assumptions about her character and availability, but having it reduced to a business transaction in front of Jack felt like the final insult. Get out. Her voice was steady despite the fury burning in her veins. Now, Rose, be reasonable, Blackwood began. I said get out. This time there was steel in her tone, the kind of hardness that came from finally reaching the end of her tolerance for other people's assumptions about who she was and what she owed the world. Jack hadn't moved, but Rose could feel tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. When he spoke, his words carried the kind of finality that ended conversations permanently. The lady asked you to leave. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly, revealing the ugly calculation beneath his polished exterior. This doesn't concern you, Drifter. You'll be moving on soon enough, but Miss O'Malley will still be here when you're gone. No, Jack said simply. She won't. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, challenging everyone present to understand their implications. Rose stared at Jack in shock, trying to process what he'd just said and what it might mean. Excuse me. Blackwood's voice sharpened with interest. Jack's eyes never left the other man's face. Miss O'Malley won't be available for your business arrangements because she'll be otherwise occupied. Occupied how? Jack turned slightly, his gaze finding Rose's across the suddenly silent saloon. What she saw in those green depths made her heart stutter against her ribs. Determination, protectiveness, and something deeper that made her forget how to breathe. She'll be my wife. The declaration hit Rose like a lightning strike, sending shock waves through her entire being. Marriage. He was talking about marriage, about binding their futures together in the most permanent way possible. It was solution and revolution all at once, protection wrapped in promise. Blackwood laughed, the sound ugly in the hushed saloon. A marriage of convenience? How romantic. But I'm afraid it changes nothing legally. The debt remains, regardless of Miss O'Malley's marital status. You're right, Jack agreed calmly. The debt remains, but the terms of payment can be renegotiated. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. Rose's eyes widened as Jack emptied the contents onto the nearest table, revealing more money than she'd seen in one place in her entire life. Where did you? Pete began. Sold some land back in Missouri before I came west. Jack explained without taking his eyes off Blackwood. Been carrying it with me, looking for the right investment opportunity. Blackwood's expression had shifted from smug confidence to calculating greed. That's substantial, but I'm afraid the full amount will be met, Jack interrupted, along with reasonable interest. In cash. Today. Rose felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. Jack was prepared to sacrifice everything he owned to protect her, to buy her freedom from men like Blackwood who saw her as merchandise. The gesture was simultaneously the most generous and most terrifying thing anyone had ever offered her. Jack, she whispered, but he shook his head slightly, asking for her trust without words. Blackwood was studying the gold with obvious avarice, his earlier proposition apparently forgotten in the face of immediate profit. I suppose arrangements could be made. For the full amount plus interest, of course. Of course. Jack's agreement carried an undertone that suggested he understood exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Pete, you'd better fetch the deed so we can transfer ownership properly. Transfer ownership? Rose's voice cracked on the words. Jack's smile was gentle, meant for her alone. Figured if I'm going to be your husband, I should probably be able to provide for you properly. The Silver Dollar's got good bones. With the right care, it could be the finest establishment in the territory. The business transaction proceeded with efficient brutality. Papers signed and money changed hands while Rose stood frozen in the center of the transforming reality. In less than an hour, Jack had purchased not just the saloon, but her freedom from Blackwood's schemes. More than that, he'd publicly claimed her as his future wife, binding their fates together before God and witnesses. When Blackwood and his men finally left, pockets heavy with gold and expressions sour with defeat, the silence in the saloon felt profound and strange. Pete was staring at the deed papers like they might disappear if he blinked, while Rose struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Well," Pete said finally. "That was something." Jack was already moving, gathering up his tools with the methodical precision that marked everything he did. "I'll move my things out of the stable room tonight. Give you folks some privacy to discuss the new arrangements." "Jack, wait." Rose's voice stopped him at the door, her heart hammering against her ribs as she struggled to find words adequate to the moment. "What you just did was necessary." Jack's expression was patient, understanding. "Blackwood won't be the last man to come sniffing around, looking to take advantage. This way, you're protected." "Protected by a marriage that isn't real?" The words carried more pain than Rose had intended, revealing fears she'd barely admitted to herself. Jack set down his tools and crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. The touch was warm and steadying, grounding her in the moment. "Rose," he said softly, "what makes you think it won't be real?" The question hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn. Rose searched his face, looking for signs of deception or calculation, for any hint that this was just another transaction dressed up in romantic language. What she found instead was the same quiet certainty she'd seen from the first day he'd walked through those doors, the unwavering conviction of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was prepared to work for it. "Because men like you don't marry women like me," she whispered. Jack's hands tightened on her shoulders, not roughly, but with the kind of firm reassurance that anchored ships in storms. "What kind of woman are you, Rose?" The question was clearly a challenge, daring her to voice the ugly assumptions that had shaped her understanding of her place in the world. Rose felt tears prick her eyes as years of accumulated shame rose in her throat like bile. "The kind who works in saloons. The kind who serves drinks to men who think they can buy anything they want. The kind who survives," Jack interrupted firmly. "The kind who works honest jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over her head. The kind who shows kindness to strangers and loyalty to friends like Pete. The kind who deserves to be cherished instead of used." Rose shook her head, unable to accept his assessment even as part of her desperately wanted to believe it. "You don't understand. I've made mistakes, done things." "So have I." Jack's admission was quiet but absolute. "We've all got things in our past we'd change if we could. But that's what the past is for, learning from, not living in." His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. The gesture was so tender, so careful, that it broke something loose in Rose's chest that had been locked away for years. "The question isn't what we've done before," Jack continued. "The question is what we're going to do now. And what I'm going to do is love you properly, the way you deserve to be loved. If you'll let me." Rose stared up into his face, seeing her future reflected in those steady green eyes. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, this possibility of happiness she'd trained herself not to want. "1 year," she said, echoing their earlier agreement. "1 year," Jack confirmed. "But Rose." "Yes." His smile was soft and sure, full of promises she was only beginning to understand. "I'm hoping for a lot more than that." That evening, after Pete had retired to his room with a bottle of whiskey and a dazed expression, Rose found herself alone with Jack in the transformed saloon. Lamplight danced across the polished surfaces he'd created, turning the familiar space into something magical and new. "Second thoughts?" Jack asked, settling into the chair across from her at one of his handcrafted tables. Rose considered the question seriously. In the space of a single afternoon, her entire life had been rearranged. She was engaged to a man she'd known for less than a month, tied to a business she'd never owned, protected by promises she wasn't sure she deserved. About which part? Any of it. All of it. Jack's expression was patient, giving her permission to voice any doubts or fears. "This happened fast, Rose. Faster than either of us planned. If you need time to think." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Rose had intended, surprising them both. "No, I don't need time to think. What I need is to understand why." "Why what?" Rose gestured around them, taking in the beautiful room and the mountain of a man who'd created it. "Why this? Why me? You could have any woman in the territory, Jack. You're handsome, skilled, obviously capable of providing well. Why tie yourself to someone with my reputation?" Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same careful attention he brought to examining a piece of wood before shaping it. "What do you think your reputation is?" The question caught Rose off guard. What do you mean?" "I mean, what exactly do people say about Rose O'Malley? Because in the month I've been here, all I've heard is that you're honest, hardworking, and fair. That you've never caused trouble for anyone, never taken advantage of customers, never promised what you weren't willing to deliver." Rose blinked in surprise. "That's not. People don't usually." "Don't usually what?" "Speak well of saloon girls." Jack's tone was gentle but pointed. "Maybe not, but they speak well of you. Mrs. Patterson told me you sat with her sick daughter for 3 nights when the fever was bad. Charlie Brennan says you're the only person in town who remembers exactly how he likes his coffee. Even Blackwood's men respect you enough to keep their hands to themselves when you tell them to." Rose felt something shift in her understanding of herself, like a picture coming into clearer focus. She'd been so focused on the shame and assumptions that came with her job that she'd forgotten to notice the relationships she'd built, the respect she'd earned through her actions rather than her occupation. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted. "That's because you're looking at yourself through other people's eyes instead of your own," Jack said. "Or worse, through the eyes of the worst people you've encountered." He reached across the table, his large hand covering hers with gentle warmth. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Rose. I see a woman who's faced hardships that would have broken lesser people, but came through them with her kindness and tact. I see someone who works honestly for everything she has, who treats people fairly regardless of their station in life. I see beauty, yes, but more than that. I see strength and intelligence and a heart that's capable of great love if someone proves worthy of it." Rose felt tears threaten again, but this time they came from hope rather than despair. "And you think you're worthy of it?" Jack's smile was self-deprecating. "I think I want to be. I think I'm willing to spend the rest of my life trying to be." The promise hung between them like a vow, more binding than any ceremony could make it. Rose found herself leaning forward, drawn by the sincerity in his voice and the steady warmth in his eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we plan a wedding," Jack replied practically. "Something simple but proper. Give the town something to celebrate instead of gossip about. And after that," Jack's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze drifting around the transformed saloon. "After that, we build something together. This place could be more than just a saloon, Rose. With your knowledge of the business and my craftsmanship, we could create something special. A restaurant, maybe, or a proper hotel. Something that serves the community and gives us both a legacy to be proud of." Rose tried to imagine it. The silver dollar transformed again, this time into something entirely new and wonderful. She could picture families dining at Jack's handcrafted tables, travelers resting comfortably in rooms furnished with his careful workmanship, herself as hostess rather than serving girl. "It's a beautiful dream," she said softly. "It doesn't have to be just a dream." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "Dreams are just plans that haven't been built yet." As they sat together in the lamplight, planning their impossible future, Rose felt something she'd thought lost forever beginning to bloom in her chest. Hope, fragile as new grass, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Jack McKenzie had walked into her life promising to make her forget every man before him. But what he was actually doing was far more revolutionary. He was helping her remember who she was beneath all the assumptions and limitations she'd accepted as truth. Outside, the November wind howled around the corners of the building, but inside the silver dollar, warmed by lamplight and possibility, the future felt as solid and beautiful as anything Jack's skilled hands could create. The wedding of Rose Catherine O'Malley and Jack Mountain McKenzie took place on a crystalline December morning when the snow lay thick as feather quilts across Silver Creek's rooftops. Word had spread through the small community with the speed of wildfire, bringing nearly every resident to witness the union of the saloon girl and the gentle giant who'd transformed their little corner of Montana territory. Rose stood before the mirror in her small room behind the kitchen, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. The dress had been Mrs. Patterson's contribution, ivory silk that had belonged to her late daughter, carefully altered to fit Rose's more generous curves. Martha Stevens had contributed the veil, delicate Brussels lace that had been in her family for 3 generations. Even Dr. Morrison's stern wife had appeared at the silver dollar's door with a borrowed string of pearls, declaring that every bride deserved something beautiful for her wedding day. "You look like an angel," Pete said from the doorway, his weathered face soft with emotion. Sarah would have loved to see this day. Rose turned from the mirror, feeling the unfamiliar weight of hope settling around her shoulders like the borrowed veil. "Are you sure about giving me away? People might talk." Pete's laugh was gruff but warm. "Let them talk. You've been like a daughter to me these past 3 years, Rose. It's my honor to walk you down that aisle." The ceremony itself was held in the transformed silver dollar, which Jack had decorated with pine boughs and winter flowers that Martha Stevens had somehow coaxed to bloom in her greenhouse. Reverend Matthews, a circuit preacher who'd arrived just that morning, stood before the gleaming bar while the town's residents filled every available chair and lined the walls. Jack waited at the makeshift altar in a suit that had clearly been tailored for his massive frame, his dark hair neatly combed and his green eyes fixed on the doorway where Rose would appear. When she finally emerged on Pete's arm, walking slowly across the polished floor he'd crafted with his own hands, Jack's expression transformed into something so tender and reverent that several women in the audience reached for their handkerchiefs. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed saloon. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Jackson Lee Mackenzie and Rose Catherine O'Malley in holy matrimony." The words washed over Rose like a benediction, each phrase carrying weight she'd never expected to feel. This wasn't the marriage of convenience she'd imagined when Jack first made his dramatic proposal. Somewhere between his protection and his promises, between his gentle touch and unwavering respect, it had become something far more precious, a true joining of hearts and futures. "Do you, Jackson, take Rose to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Jack's answer came without hesitation, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I do. And do you, Rose, take Jackson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Rose looked up into Jack's face, seeing her future reflected in those steady green eyes. All her fears and doubts seemed to fall away, leaving only the certainty that this man would keep every promise he'd ever made to her. "I do." The ring Jack slipped onto her finger was a revelation, a band of rose gold set with a perfect emerald that caught the morning light like captured summer. Rose stared at it in amazement, wondering when he'd found time to commission such a beautiful piece. "Made it myself," Jack murmured for her ears alone. "Found the stone in Missouri, been carrying it for months, waiting for the right woman to give it to." Before Rose could respond, Reverend Matthews was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Jack was lifting her veil with hands that trembled slightly despite their size and strength. The kiss that followed was gentle and reverent, a promise sealed in the presence of God and community. The celebration that followed transformed the silver dollar into something magical. Tables groaned under dishes contributed by every family in town. Roasted venison from the Patterson Ranch, fresh bread from Martha Stevens' kitchen, apple pies that filled the air with cinnamon and warmth. Someone had produced a fiddle, and soon the polished floor that Jack had installed was filled with dancing couples. Rose found herself swept from partner to partner, welcomed into the community with an enthusiasm that left her breathless. These people, farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and their wives, were celebrating her marriage as if she'd always been one of them, as if her past held no power over her future. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Charlie Brennan said with a flourish as he spun her around the dance floor. "Got a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Mrs. Mackenzie. The name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue, like a gift she hadn't dared to ask for. When the dance ended and Jack claimed her for the next song, Rose felt as if she were floating on air. "Having second thoughts yet?" Jack asked as he guided her through the steps of a simple waltz. "About which part?" Rose countered, echoing their conversation from the night he'd proposed. Jack's smile was soft and sure. "Any of it. All of it." Rose looked around the transformed saloon, taking in the faces of their friends and neighbors, the warm glow of lamplight on Jack's handcrafted surfaces, the feeling of belonging that wrapped around her like a warm cloak. When her gaze returned to her husband's face. Her husband. She felt her heart overflow with a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. "Not a single one," she said firmly. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift home to their own fires and families, Rose and Jack found themselves alone in their transformed world. The silver dollar felt different now, not just repaired and beautiful, but truly theirs. Their home, their business, their future all wrapped up in polished wood and brass fittings. "So," Jack said, beginning to stack chairs with his usual methodical precision. "What happens now?" Rose watched him work, marveling at the way his massive hands handled even the simplest tasks with infinite care. "Now we figure out how to be married, I suppose. Any ideas about that?" The question carried undertones that made Rose's cheeks warm. They'd spoken of their future in practical terms, the business they'd build, the life they'd create together. But they hadn't discussed the more intimate aspects of marriage, the physical and emotional intimacy that would bind them together as husband and wife. "I suppose we start with trust," Rose said carefully. Jack paused in his work, giving her his full attention. "Trust? I've never." Rose struggled to find words for feelings she'd never allowed herself to examine. "I've never been with a man who didn't want something from me. Something I was expected to give whether I wanted to or not." Understanding dawned in Jack's eyes, followed immediately by a tenderness that made Rose's throat tight with emotion. He crossed the room slowly, giving her time to retreat if she chose, and took her hands in his. "Rose," he said gently, "what I want from you can't be taken. It can only be given freely when you're ready to give it. And if that's tomorrow or next month or next year, that's your choice to make." The promise lifted a weight from Rose's shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. In a world where women's choices were often limited by necessity and circumstance, Jack was offering her the most precious gift imaginable, agency over her own heart and body. "What if I'm never ready?" she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Jack's smile was patient and sure. "Then I'll love you anyway. Marriage isn't just about what happens in the bedroom, Rose. It's about partnership, companionship, building something together that's bigger than either of us could create alone." Rose felt tears prick her eyes at the simple certainty in his voice. "How do you make it sound so easy?" "Because it is easy when it's with the right person." Jack's thumbs brushed across her knuckles with familiar gentleness. "Love isn't supposed to be a struggle, Rose. It's supposed to be a sanctuary." That night, Rose lay in the small bed behind the kitchen while Jack made his quarters in the room above the stable, their marriage unconsummated but somehow complete in ways that had nothing to do with physical intimacy. For the first time in years, Rose felt truly safe, not just protected from external threats, but secure in the knowledge that her heart was in the hands of a man who understood its value. The next few weeks passed in a blur of domestic happiness that Rose had never imagined possible. Jack continued his improvements to the silver dollar, but now they planned each change together, discussing how to transform the space into something that would serve their community while providing them with a living. "What about a restaurant?" Rose suggested one morning as they sat over coffee and the plans Jack had sketched out on brown paper. "The nearest decent meal is in Butte, and that's a 2-day ride in good weather." Jack studied the drawings with the careful attention he brought to all his projects. "Could work. We'd need to expand the kitchen, add proper dining areas. Maybe some private rooms upstairs for travelers." "I could cook," Rose offered, then felt her cheeks warm at the presumption. "I mean, if you think I'm capable. I've been helping Pete with meals for the saloon customers, and people seem to like." "Rose." Jack's voice cut through her nervous rambling with gentle firmness. "This is our business now. Our decision. If you want to cook, then we'll build you the finest kitchen in the territory." The easy way he included her in every plan, every decision, still caught Rose off guard. She'd spent so many years having her life shaped by other people's wants and needs that the radical concept of having a say in her own future felt almost foreign. Their first real test came in early January, when a blizzard struck Silver Creek with the fury of a biblical plague. Snow fell for 3 days straight, piling against windows and doors until the world outside disappeared entirely. The few travelers caught in town took shelter at the Silver Dollar, and Rose found herself cooking for a dozen unexpected guests with supplies that were meant to last the winter. "We're going to run out of flour," she told Jack on the second day, measuring their remaining stores with growing anxiety. Jack considered the problem with his usual calm deliberation. Patterson's got extra stored in his barn. Question is how to get to it in this weather. The answer came in the form of Jack's ingenuity and sheer determination. Using lumber left over from his renovations, he constructed a series of rope-guided shelters that created a path from the Silver Dollar to the Patterson Ranch. It took him 2 days of working in conditions that would have defeated lesser men, but by the time the storm cleared, Silver Creek had a permanent winter walkway that connected the town's essential buildings. "That man of yours is something special," Martha Stevens declared as she surveyed Jack's handiwork from the warmth of the Silver Dollar's main room. "Smart as a whip and strong as an ox. You're lucky to have found him." Rose watched Jack through the window as he reinforced the final shelter, his massive frame moving with purposeful efficiency despite the bitter cold. "I'm beginning to think he found me," she murmured. The crisis had revealed something important about their partnership. They worked together with an ease that felt natural and right. Jack's practical solutions combined with Rose's organizational skills and intimate knowledge of the community created something greater than either could have achieved alone. More than that, Rose had discovered a confidence in herself that she'd never known she possessed. When faced with feeding a dozen people on dwindling supplies, she hadn't panicked or deferred to others. She'd solved the problem, marshaled resources, and kept everyone fed and warm until the storm passed. "I've been thinking," Jack said that evening as they cleaned up after the last of their unexpected guests had departed. "About what?" "About names. For the restaurant, I mean." Jack's expression was thoughtful as he polished the bar top with practiced strokes. "Something that reflects both of us, what we're building together." Rose felt a flutter of excitement at being included in such a fundamental decision. "What did you have in mind?" "Rose Mountain Inn," Jack said simply. "Combines your name with what folks have started calling me. Makes it clear we're partners in this." The name sent warmth spiraling through Rose's chest, but it was the word partners that made her breath catch. Not owner and employee, not husband and subordinate wife, but true partners in every sense of the word. "I love it," she said, and meant it completely. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the Rose Mountain Inn began to take shape both in reality and in the community's imagination. Word spread beyond Silver Creek's borders, carried by travelers who spoke of the exceptional food and warm hospitality they'd found in the middle of Montana Territory. Jack's renovations continued with Rose's input, creating dining spaces that were both elegant and welcoming, guest rooms that offered comfort without unnecessary luxury. But it was their relationship that truly flourished during those quiet winter months. Forced together by circumstances and weather, they learned each other's rhythms and preferences with the kind of intimacy that usually took years to develop. Rose discovered that Jack hummed while he worked, that he read voraciously when his hands were idle, that he had a gentle way with animals that made the stable cats follow him around like devoted disciples. Jack, in turn, learned that Rose was far more educated than her circumstances suggested, having devoured every book she could find during her years at the Silver Dollar. He discovered her gift for languages. She spoke fluent Spanish learned from Mexican ranch hands, enough German to communicate with the immigrant families settling the territory, and enough French to read the novels that arrived occasionally from back east. "You're wasted serving drinks," Jack told her one evening as she read aloud from a volume of poetry Pete had ordered from Denver. "Not wasted," Rose corrected gently. "Just misplaced for a while." The distinction felt important, acknowledging her past without allowing it to define her future. She wasn't escaping her old life so much as growing beyond it, becoming the woman she'd always had the potential to be. Their first real moment of physical intimacy came on a warm April evening when Rose found Jack working late in his workshop, crafting what appeared to be a rocking chair with extraordinary attention to detail. "Planning ahead?" she asked, running her fingers along the smooth curves he'd carved into the chair's arms. Jack's cheeks reddened slightly. "Maybe. Figured we might want children someday, and every baby deserves a proper rocking chair." The casual assumption that they would have a future together, complete with children and family traditions, made Rose's heart race with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped closer to Jack, close enough to smell sawdust and honest sweat, close enough to see the gold flecks in his green eyes. "Jack," she said softly. He turned toward her, setting down his tools with careful deliberation. "Yes," Instead of answering with words, Rose reached up and traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips, marveling at the contrast between his strength and gentleness. Jack held perfectly still, letting her explore at her own pace, his breathing careful and controlled. "I think," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm ready to be your wife." In every way. Jack's eyes darkened with emotion, but his touch remained infinitely gentle as he cupped her face in his hands. "Are you sure?" "There's no rush, Rose. We have all the time in the world." "I'm sure," Rose said, and realized she truly was. The fear that had haunted her for so long had been replaced by trust, by the certainty that Jack would never take more than she was willing to give. Their first kiss as a truly married couple was soft and questioning, a tentative exploration that gradually deepened into something more passionate. When Jack finally lifted her in his arms and carried her toward their shared future, Rose felt the last walls around her heart crumble entirely, leaving her open and vulnerable and perfectly safe. Later, lying in Jack's arms in the bed he'd crafted for them with such care and attention, Rose finally understood what he'd meant about love being a sanctuary. Here, in the circle of his protection and devotion, she wasn't the damaged saloon girl or the desperate woman who'd accepted charity from strangers. She was simply Rose Mackenzie, beloved wife and full partner in a life that promised to be everything she'd never dared to dream. "Any regrets?" Jack asked softly, his fingers combing through her hair with gentle reverence. Rose considered the question seriously, thinking of all the paths her life might have taken, all the different choices that had led her to this moment. "Only one," she said finally. Jack's hand stilled. "What's that?" Rose lifted her head to meet his eyes, her smile radiant with contentment and joy. "That I didn't meet you sooner." Jack's answering smile was soft and sure, full of promises for all the tomorrows stretching ahead of them. "We found each other when we needed to," he said simply. "That's what matters." As spring gave way to summer and the Rose Mountain Inn opened its doors to travelers from across the territory, Rose often found herself thinking about Jack's original promise, to make her forget every man before him. What he'd actually done was far more remarkable. He'd helped her remember who she was beneath all the pain and assumptions, helped her become the woman she was always meant to be. Standing in the doorway of their thriving business, watching Jack interact with guests and neighbors with the same gentle strength he'd shown her from the very beginning, Rose felt her heart overflow with gratitude and love. She had indeed forgotten every man before him, not because he'd erased her past, but because he'd given her a future so bright it made everything else fade by comparison. By the summer of 1885, the Rose Mountain Inn had become the crown jewel of Silver Creek, drawing travelers from as far as Denver and San Francisco who came specifically to experience what newspapers had begun calling frontier elegance at its finest. Rose stood in the expanded kitchen she'd designed with Jack, watching through the window as their latest guests, a family from back east on their way to settle in Oregon, marveled at the hand-carved details that decorated every surface of their establishment. "Mrs. Mackenzie," called Sarah Chun, the young Chinese woman they'd hired to help with the increased business. "The Hendersons in room 3 are asking about tomorrow's breakfast menu." Rose smiled at the formality. Despite her repeated requests to be called by her first name, Sarah maintained the respectful distance that spoke to her careful upbringing. She'd appeared at their doors 6 months ago, fleeing an arranged marriage in San Francisco's Chinatown, and Rose had recognized something of herself in the young woman's desperate courage. "Tell them we'll have fresh biscuits with honey butter, bacon from the Patterson farm, and eggs prepared however they prefer," Rose replied, checking the sourdough starter that had become one of their signature offerings. "And let them know that Jack will be demonstrating furniture making in the workshop after lunch if they're interested." The workshops had been Jack's idea, a way to share his craft while generating additional income during the busy summer months. Visitors loved watching him transform raw lumber into beautiful, functional pieces, and many left with small items, jewelry boxes, picture frames, kitchen utensils, that served as tangible reminders of their time at the Rose Mountain Inn. "You're becoming quite the businesswoman," Jack observed from the doorway, his massive frame filling the space as he surveyed the bustling kitchen with obvious pride. Rose felt the familiar flutter of happiness that accompanied Jack's presence, even after more than a year of marriage. He still looked at her like she was a miracle he couldn't quite believe was real, and she still felt her heart skip when those green eyes found hers across a crowded room. "We're becoming quite the business," she corrected, moving to stand beside him. "I couldn't do any of this without your craftsmanship and vision." Jack's arm came around her waist with easy familiarity, pulling her against his side, where she fit as perfectly as a puzzle piece finding its place. The casual intimacy still amazed Rose. The way Jack touched her throughout the day, small gestures of affection and connection that spoke of deep contentment rather than urgent desire. "Speaking of vision," Jack said, his voice carrying a note of excitement that made Rose look up at him curiously. "I've been thinking about expansion." "What kind of expansion?" Jack turned her toward the window that faced west, where the afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "See that meadow beyond the Patterson place? The one that backs up to Silver Creek?" Rose nodded, though she wasn't sure where his thoughts were leading. "It's for sale. Has been for months, ever since old Henrik Larson decided to move back to his daughter's place in Minnesota." Jack's voice carried the careful excitement of a man with big dreams and practical plans to achieve them. 20 acres of good land, with water rights and timber access. Rose felt her pulse quicken with possibility. "What would we do with 20 acres? Build something permanent. Something that'll outlast both of us." Jack's hand tightened slightly on her waist. "I'm talking about a real hotel, Rose. 2 stories, maybe 3. Proper guest rooms, a grand dining hall, maybe even a ballroom for special occasions. Turn this whole area into a destination instead of just a stopping point." The vision he painted was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Rose could picture it clearly, an elegant hotel that would draw visitors from across the country, putting Silver Creek on the map as more than just another frontier town. But the practical side of her mind immediately began calculating costs and complications. "That would take enormous amounts of money," she said carefully. "More than we've saved, even with how well the inn is doing." "True," Jack agreed. "But we've got something more valuable than money. We've got a reputation. Every guest who stayed here has gone home singing our praises. The territorial governor himself wrote us a letter of recommendation after his visit last month." Rose remembered that visit well. Governor Preston had arrived expecting rough frontier accommodations and left declaring the Rose Mountain in the finest establishment west of Chicago. His letter, prominently displayed in their front lobby, had already brought them a steady stream of distinguished visitors. "You think we could get investors?" "I think we could get partners," Jack corrected. "People who understand that what we're building here is special, worth being part of." Before Rose could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the front yard. A dust-covered stagecoach was pulling up to their door, but this wasn't the regular mail coach that served Silver Creek twice a week. This was a private conveyance, expensive and well-appointed, carrying passengers who clearly had money to spend. "Were we expecting anyone?" Jack asked, already moving toward the front door with Rose close behind. The coach door opened to reveal a woman in traveling clothes that probably cost more than most people in Silver Creek earned in a year. She was perhaps 40, with silver-streaked hair arranged in an elaborate style and jewelry that caught the afternoon light like captured stars. Behind her emerged a gentleman of similar age and obvious wealth, his suit perfectly tailored despite the rigors of frontier travel. "Good afternoon," the woman called in cultured tones that spoke of Eastern education and refined upbringing. "Would this be the Rose Mountain Inn? We've traveled quite far on the strength of recommendations from friends in Denver." "It would indeed," Rose replied, automatically shifting into the gracious hostess role she'd perfected over the past year. "I'm Rose McKenzie, and this is my husband Jack. Welcome to Silver Creek." The woman's smile was warm and genuine as she approached. "How wonderful to meet you both. I'm Victoria Ashford, and this is my husband Charles. We're from San Francisco, though we spend considerable time traveling throughout the territories on business." As Jack helped with their luggage and Rose guided them toward the inn's entrance, Victoria Ashford continued speaking, her eyes taking in every detail of the building and grounds with obvious appreciation. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," she observed, running her gloved hand along the intricately carved porch railing. "This is all original work." "My husband's," Rose said with pride. "Jack's a master craftsman. Every piece of furniture, every decorative element you'll see was made by his hands." Charles Ashford had remained largely silent during the introductions, but now he spoke up with the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to making important decisions quickly. Mrs. Mackenzie, Mr. Mackenzie, would it be possible to arrange a private dinner this evening? My wife and I have a business proposition that might interest you, and we'd prefer to discuss it away from other ears. Rose felt Jack tense slightly beside her, his protective instincts awakened by the mention of business. They'd both learned to be cautious of unexpected propositions, especially from wealthy strangers who appeared without warning. Of course, Rose replied smoothly. We'd be honored to have you as our guests. Shall we say 7 o'clock in our private dining room? That evening, Rose took special care with both the menu and her appearance. She prepared roasted quail with wild berry sauce, fresh trout from Silver Creek, vegetables from their own garden, and a selection of desserts that showcased the culinary skills she'd developed over the past year. For herself, she chose her finest dress, deep green silk that Jack had bought for her on a trip to Butte, with pearl buttons that had belonged to his grandmother. You look beautiful, Jack murmured as he adjusted his string tie before the mirror in their bedroom. He'd grown more comfortable with formal occasions as their clientele had become more sophisticated, but Rose could still see traces of nervousness in the careful way he arranged his collar. So do you? Rose replied honestly. Jack informal wear was a sight to behold. His massive frame somehow made elegant by well-tailored clothing, his rugged features softened by the warm lamplight. Whatever they want to discuss, we'll face it together. Jack's smile was warm and reassuring. Always. The private dining room that Jack had created in the inn's original space was a masterpiece of intimate elegance. Soft lamplight reflected off polished wood surfaces, and the table was set with their finest china and crystal. The Ashfords arrived precisely at 7, both dressed for a formal dinner that wouldn't have been out of place in the finest restaurants of New York or San Francisco. This is absolutely charming, Victoria declared as Jack seated her at the table. The atmosphere is every bit as sophisticated as anything we've experienced in the major cities, yet it maintains a warmth and authenticity that's utterly unique. The dinner proceeded with the kind of pleasant conversation that characterized successful social occasions, discussion of travel, mutual acquaintances, and shared observations about the changing character of the American West. But Rose could sense an undercurrent of purpose beneath the polite pleasantries, a sense that the Ashfords were evaluating her and Jack as much as they were enjoying the meal. It wasn't until the dessert course had been served and the wine glasses refilled that Charles Ashford finally broached the subject that had brought them to Silver Creek. Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, he began, his tone shifting to something more businesslike while remaining perfectly cordial. My wife and I are investors, primarily in hospitality and transportation ventures throughout the Western Territories. We've built a portfolio of properties from California to Colorado, always looking for exceptional opportunities. Rose felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and anxiety. This was clearly leading somewhere significant, but she couldn't yet tell whether it would be opportunity or threat. What brings you to our little corner of Montana? Jack asked, his voice carefully neutral. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. You do, Mr. Mackenzie. Or rather, what you've built here does. Word of the Rose Mountain Inn has reached some very influential circles, and we've heard nothing but praise for your hospitality, your craftsmanship, and your vision. That's very kind, Rose replied cautiously. It's not kindness, my dear, it's business sense, Charles interjected. Victoria and I didn't become successful by flattering people unnecessarily. We came here because we believe you've created something genuinely special, something with enormous potential for growth. Here it comes, Rose thought, bracing herself for the inevitable attempt to buy them out or muscle them aside. She'd seen it happen to other successful businesses, outside investors appearing with offers that seemed generous but ultimately stripped local owners of control over their own enterprises. What exactly are you proposing? Jack asked, his carpenter's hands resting calmly on the table despite the tension Rose could feel radiating from him. Partnership, Victoria said simply. Not ownership, not a buyout, but genuine partnership in expanding what you've created here. Rose blinked in surprise. Partnership? Charles nodded, producing a leather portfolio from beside his chair. We understand you're considering expansion, a larger hotel, perhaps something that could accommodate the growing interest in Western tourism. Such an undertaking would require significant capital investment, but it would also offer tremendous returns if handled properly. How do you know about our expansion plans? Rose asked, though she kept her tone friendly despite her suspicion. Victoria's smile was understanding. My dear, successful business people talk to each other. Governor Preston mentioned your conversation during his visit, and several of our associates in Denver have heard rumors about land purchases and building plans. No land purchases yet, Jack said carefully. Just conversations and possibilities. Exactly why we're here, Charles replied, opening his portfolio to reveal detailed architectural drawings and financial projections. We'd like to make those possibilities into realities. Rose leaned forward to study the papers, her breath catching as she took in the scope and elegance of what the Ashfords were proposing. The drawings showed a grand hotel that would rival anything in San Francisco or Denver, but designed with sensitivity to the mountain setting and incorporating design elements that clearly drew from Jack's distinctive craftsmanship. This is beautiful, she said honestly. But the cost would be substantial, Charles agreed. But also manageable, with the right partnership structure. We're proposing to provide the majority of the capital investment in exchange for a 40% stake in the expanded enterprise. You would retain controlling interest and complete creative authority over design and operations. Jack studied the drawings with the careful attention he brought to all complex projects. What's your timeline? Construction could begin this fall, if we move quickly on the land acquisition and permits, Victoria replied. The goal would be to open for the 1887 tourist season, giving us time to build properly without rushing the important details. Rose felt her head spinning with the magnitude of what they were discussing. 2 years ago, she'd been a saloon girl with no prospects beyond serving drinks and deflecting unwanted advances. Now she was being offered partnership in what could become one of the finest hotels in the entire western United States. This is very generous, she said carefully. But why us? Surely there are more experienced hoteliers who would welcome your investment. Victoria's expression grew thoughtful. Experience can be learned, my dear. What can't be taught is the kind of authentic hospitality and attention to detail that you've created here. Charles and I have stayed in dozens of hotels throughout our travels, but very few have made us feel genuinely welcomed rather than simply accommodated. Furthermore, Charles added, your husband's craftsmanship is genuinely exceptional. The pieces we've seen here are museum quality, and that kind of artistic vision can't be purchased or replicated. It has to be authentic. Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting Rose's across the table in silent communication. She could see him weighing possibilities and risks, considering the implications of such a dramatic expansion for both their business and their personal lives. We'll need time to consider this, Jack said finally. It's a generous offer, but it's also a significant decision. Of course, Victoria replied graciously. We wouldn't expect an immediate answer to such a proposal. We're planning to remain in the area for several days, exploring the land in question and meeting with local officials about permits and logistics. Perhaps you could give us your answer before we depart. After the Ashfords retired to their room, Rose and Jack found themselves alone in the private dining room, surrounded by the remnants of an evening that might have changed their lives forever. What do you think? Rose asked, though she could tell from Jack's expression that his thoughts were as conflicted as her own. I think they're serious, Jack replied slowly. The plans are professional, the financial projections seem realistic, and they've clearly done their research about us and the local market. But, Jack's smile was rueful, but nothing in life is ever that simple. If we do this, we're not just expanding our business, we're changing it completely. The Rose Mountain Inn would become something much bigger, much more public. We'd lose some of the intimacy that makes this place special. Rose nodded, understanding his concerns because she shared them. The inn as it existed now was theirs in every sense, created by their hands, shaped by their vision, operated according to their values. A grand hotel would necessarily involve compromises and committees, shareholders and schedules that might not align with their personal desires. On the other hand, Rose said thoughtfully, it would also let us reach more people, employ more of our neighbors, really put Silver Creek on the map as a destination. The economic impact on the whole community could be enormous. True, Jack agreed. And the craftsmanship opportunities would be incredible. Building something on that scale, with that level of detail and artistry, it would be the project of a lifetime. They talked long into the night, weighing advantages against risks, dreams against realities. By the time they finally retired to bed, they were no closer to a decision but much clearer about what factors would ultimately determine their choice. The next morning brought unexpected clarity in the form of a visitor neither had anticipated. Rose was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Sarah announced that someone was asking to speak with her privately. "Who is it?" Rose asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Says his name is O'Malley," Sarah replied. "Claims to be your brother." Rose felt the world tilt around her as memories she'd buried years ago came flooding back. Patrick O'Malley, her older brother who'd disappeared when she was 17, leaving her alone to face their father's debts and their creditors' demands. The brother who'd promised to come back for her and never had, forcing her to make the desperate choices that had eventually led her to Silver Creek and the Silver Dollar Saloon. "Tell him I'll be right there," Rose managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Patrick was waiting in the inn's front lobby, hat in hand and guilt written across features that still resembled her own despite the years and hardships that had marked them both. He was thinner than she remembered, weathered by whatever life he'd lived since leaving their family farm in Illinois, but his eyes were the same green as her own. "Rose," he said softly, you look wonderful." "No thanks to you," Rose replied, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. She'd thought she'd forgiven Patrick years ago, but seeing him brought back all the anger and abandonment she'd felt when he disappeared. "I know I have no right to be here," Patrick said quickly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness or your time, but I had to come, had to see if you were all right. Now you're concerned about whether I'm all right." Rose's voice rose slightly, drawing a curious glance from one of the inn's guests. She forced herself to speak more quietly. "Where was that concern 8 years ago when you left me to clean up the mess you and father made?" Patrick's face crumpled with shame. "I was a coward, Rose. I was scared and selfish, and I convinced myself you'd be better off without me around to make things worse." "Better off?" Rose felt years of suppressed anger bubbling to the surface. "I lost the farm, Patrick. Lost everything we grew up with because I couldn't make the payments alone. Do you have any idea what I had to do to survive after that?" "I heard," Patrick said quietly. "That's why I'm here. I heard you were working in saloons, heard about the kind of life you were living, and I wanted to make amends." Rose felt Jack's presence before she saw him, his massive form appearing in the doorway with the kind of quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. Patrick's eyes widened as he took in Jack's size and obvious strength, and Rose saw him reassess whatever assumptions he'd made about her current situation. "Rose," Jack's voice was calm, but carried an undertone that suggested he was prepared to remove Patrick forcibly if necessary. "Everything all right?" "Jack, this is my brother Patrick," Rose said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Patrick, this is my husband, Jack Mackenzie." The word husband hit Patrick like a physical blow, his eyes darting between Rose and Jack with obvious confusion. "Husband? But I heard you were." "Were what?" Rose's voice carried a dangerous edge. "What exactly did you hear about me, Patrick?" Patrick's face reddened with embarrassment. "I heard you were working in saloons, serving drinks and entertaining men for money. I came here to help you, to get you out of that life." Jack moved closer to Rose, his presence both protective and supportive without being possessive. Rose felt strength flow from his nearness, the confidence that came from knowing she wasn't facing this confrontation alone. "I was working in a saloon," Rose said clearly. "I served drinks and cleaned tables and kept books for an honest businessman who gave me fair wages and treated me with respect. And yes, men propositioned me regularly, but I never accepted their offers. I survived, Patrick, without your help or anyone else's charity." "I'm sorry," Patrick said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't mean to suggest. I just wanted to help, to make up for abandoning you." 8 years too late," Rose replied, but some of the anger had drained out of her voice, replaced by a weary sadness for all the years they'd lost. Jack's hand found her shoulder, a gentle touch that reminded her she wasn't the desperate girl Patrick had left behind. She was Rose Mackenzie now, successful businesswoman and beloved wife, owner of one of the finest establishments in Montana Territory. "Patrick," she said more gently, "I appreciate that you came. I do. But I don't need rescuing anymore. I haven't needed rescuing for a long time." Patrick looked around the elegant lobby, taking in the evidence of Rose's success and prosperity with obvious amazement. "This is yours." "Ours," Rose corrected, glancing up at Jack with a smile that made her husband's eyes warm with love. "We built this together." The conversation that followed was awkward but necessary, as Patrick shared the story of his wandering years, failed mining ventures in California, ranch work in Colorado, finally settling into carpentry work in Wyoming, where he'd heard rumors about Rose's life that had driven him to seek her out. "I have a shop in Cheyenne now," he said, producing a business card with obvious pride. "Nothing fancy, but it's honest work and it pays well enough." "Carpentry." Jack's interest was immediate and genuine. "What kind of work do you do?" As the two men discussed woodworking techniques and shared experiences, Rose found some of her anger fading. Patrick might have abandoned her when she needed him most, but he'd clearly learned from his mistakes and built a respectable life for himself. More importantly, his arrival had forced her to confront how far she'd come from the desperate girl he'd left behind. "I should go," Patrick said finally, standing and settling his hat back on his head. "I can see you don't need my help, and I don't have any right to your forgiveness. But Rose, I'm proud of what you've built here, proud of who you've become." Rose felt tears prick her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "Patrick, we're family. We'll always be family, no matter what happened before. But I need time to process this, to figure out how I feel about having you back in my life." Patrick nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be in town for a few days, staying at the boarding house. If you change your mind about talking more." After he left, Rose found herself in Jack's arms, finally letting the tears come as she processed the emotional upheaval of seeing her brother again. "How do you feel?" Jack asked gently, his large hands stroking her hair with infinite tenderness. "Confused," Rose admitted. "Angry and sad and relieved all at the same time. I thought I'd dealt with all that old pain, but seeing him brought it all back." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Jack suggested. "Maybe you needed to face it one more time, as the woman you are now instead of the girl you were then." Rose pulled back to look up at her husband, marveling once again at his wisdom and insight. "How do you always know exactly what I need to hear?" Jack's smile was soft and sure. "Because I love you. All of you, including the parts that hurt." That evening, as they prepared for bed in their private quarters, Rose found herself thinking about the parallel timing of Patrick's arrival and the Ashfords' proposition. Both represented connections to worlds beyond Silver Creek. Patrick to her past, the Ashfords to a possible future that was both thrilling and terrifying in its scope. "I think I know what I want to do about the hotel," she said suddenly. Jack paused in unlacing his boots, giving her his complete attention. "What's that?" "I want to say yes," Rose said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not because it's safe or practical, but because it's the kind of dream worth taking risks for. And because I think we're strong enough now to handle whatever challenges come with it." Jack's smile was brilliant with pride and love. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Rose replied. "Patrick's visit reminded me that we can't live our lives trying to avoid risks or protect ourselves from disappointment. Sometimes you have to trust that the foundation you've built is strong enough to support bigger dreams." Jack crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around with the exuberant joy of a man whose wife had just agreed to build castles in the air with him. "In that case, Mrs. Mackenzie," he said, setting her down and framing her face with his hands, "we'd better start planning the grandest hotel the West has ever seen." As they kissed in the lamplight of their bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of all they'd already built together, Rose felt the future stretch out before them like an uncharted territory full of infinite possibilities. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had everything else, together, with love as their foundation and dreams as their guide. 3 years later, on a crisp October morning in 1888, Rose Mackenzie stood on the grand veranda of the Rose Mountain Grand Hotel, watching the first autumn snow dust the peaks that surrounded their mountain paradise. The hotel behind her was everything the Ashfords had promised and more. 3 stories of Montana stone and timber, with guest accommodations that rivaled the finest establishments in New York or San Francisco, yet maintained the authentic Western charm that had made their original and so beloved. "Admiring your empire?" Jack's voice carried warmth and pride as he joined her at the carved wooden railing, his massive hands wrapping around a steaming cup of coffee that looked tiny in his grasp. Rose smiled, leaning into her husband's solid warmth as she surveyed the bustling activity in the courtyard below. Guests were beginning to stir, emerging from their rooms to enjoy breakfast on the terraces that Jack had designed to capture the morning sun and frame the spectacular mountain views. Sarah Chun, now their head of guest services, was directing a team of staff members with the quiet efficiency that had made her indispensable to their operation. Our empire, Rose corrected gently, the same distinction she'd been making for 3 years of marriage. Though I have to admit, sometimes I still can't quite believe it's real. The Rose Mountain Grand Hotel was indeed an empire of sorts, employing nearly 50 people from Silver Creek and the surrounding ranches, drawing visitors from across the country and even from Europe. The guest registry read like a who's who of American society: railroad barons and cattle kings, politicians and artists, all drawn by the combination of luxury accommodations and authentic frontier experiences that had become their signature. But more than the business success, Rose marveled at the life she and Jack had built together. Their marriage had deepened and strengthened through the challenges of construction, the complexities of managing a large enterprise, and the simple daily joy of partnership in all things. They had become not just husband and wife, but true collaborators, each bringing their unique strengths to everything they created together. Mrs. Mackenzie? A young voice drew Rose's attention to the veranda doors, where Tommy Patterson stood with his hat in his hands and excitement written across his 14-year-old features. My pa sent me to tell you the new furniture's arrived from Denver. Rose felt a familiar flutter of anticipation. Jack had commissioned a complete bedroom suite from a Denver craftsman whose work he'd admired, intended as a surprise for the anniversary of their first meeting, which would be tomorrow, for years since he'd walked through the Silver Dollar's doors and changed her life forever. Thank you, Tommy, Rose said, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. Tell your father we'll be right down. As Tommy scampered away, Jack set down his coffee cup and turned to face Rose fully, his green eyes serious despite the smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Actually, he said, there's something else that arrived this morning. Something I think you'll want to see. The mysterious tone in his voice sparked Rose's curiosity as Jack led her through the hotel's elegant main lobby, past the massive stone fireplace where several guests were already gathering with their morning papers, and into the private office they shared behind the front desk. On Rose's desk sat an ornate envelope bearing an official seal she didn't immediately recognize. Jack's expression was carefully neutral as he gestured for her to open it, but Rose could see suppressed excitement dancing in his eyes. Rose broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy paper within, her breath catching as she read the letterhead. Office of the Governor, State of Montana. Jack, she whispered, looking up at her husband with wide eyes. Montana's been granted statehood. Read on, Jack encouraged gently. Rose's eyes skimmed the formal language, her pulse quickening as the meaning became clear. The new state government was forming a tourism commission to promote Montana's natural wonders and encourage economic development through travel and hospitality. They were inviting Rose and Jack Mackenzie to serve as founding members of the commission, recognizing their exceptional contributions to Montana's reputation as a premier destination for discriminating travelers. They want us to help shape tourism policy for the entire state, Rose said, still hardly believing what she was reading. They want you, Jack corrected gently. The letter specifically mentions your vision for sustainable tourism that benefits local communities while preserving the natural beauty that draws visitors in the first place. Rose set the letter down with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. For years ago, she'd been a saloon girl with no prospects beyond serving drinks. Now she was being asked to help guide an entire state's economic future. I don't know if I'm qualified for something like this, she admitted. Jack's laugh was warm and incredulous. Rose, you've transformed a failing saloon into the most successful hotel in the territory. You've created jobs for half the people in Silver Creek and established tourism routes that bring revenue to dozens of communities. If that doesn't qualify you to advise on tourism development, I don't know what would. Before Rose could respond, a commotion in the lobby drew their attention. Through the office's glass partition, they could see the hotel's front doors opening to admit a familiar figure. Victoria Ashford, elegant as always despite the rigors of frontier travel, but accompanied this time by two people Rose didn't recognize. The Ashfords. Jack's eyebrows rose in surprise. They weren't expected until next month. Rose smoothed her skirts and checked her appearance in the small mirror beside the door. Even after 3 years of partnership, she still felt slightly nervous when dealing with Victoria and Charles Ashford. Not because they were difficult, quite the opposite, but because their approval had come to mean so much to both her and Jack. Mrs. Mackenzie. Mr. Mackenzie. Victoria's voice carried across the lobby as Rose and Jack emerged from their office. How wonderful to see you both looking so well. The embrace Victoria offered was warm and genuine, the kind of affection that had developed between them over years of successful collaboration. Charles followed with his customary firm handshake and the small smile that was as close to emotional display as the reserved businessman ever came. Victoria, Charles, Rose said warmly. This is an unexpected pleasure. I thought you weren't planning to visit until the Thanksgiving celebration. Plans changed, Victoria replied, her eyes bright with an excitement that immediately put Rose on alert. Charles and I have some news that simply couldn't wait for letters. And I'd like you to meet our companions, Mr. Harrison Webb from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, and Miss Catherine Morrison, who writes for Harper's Bazaar magazine. Rose felt Jack's hand find the small of her back, a steadying touch that had become second nature during formal introductions. The presence of a railroad executive and a national magazine writer suggested this visit was about more than social pleasantries. How do you do? Rose said, extending her hand to each newcomer in turn. Welcome to the Rose Mountain Grand Hotel. Harrison Webb was a man in his 50s with the kind of confidence that came from moving large amounts of money and making decisions that affected thousands of people. His handshake was firm, his gaze assessing as he took in the hotel's elegant lobby and Rose's professional demeanor. Mrs. Mackenzie, he said, I've heard remarkable things about what you and your husband have accomplished here. The stories don't do justice to the reality. Catherine Morrison was younger, perhaps Rose's age, with the sharp eyes and careful attention to detail that marked successful journalists. Her traveling dress was practical but well-made, and she carried herself with the confidence of a woman accustomed to navigating male-dominated professional spaces. Miss Morrison, Rose said, curious about what had brought a Harper's Bazaar writer to rural Montana. Please, call me Catherine, the writer replied with a warm smile. I'm here because Victoria has been regaling me with stories about the remarkable woman who's revolutionizing hospitality in the American West. I'm writing a series of articles about women entrepreneurs, and your story is exactly what our readers want to hear. Rose felt heat creep up her neck at the unexpected attention. I'm not sure my story is particularly remarkable. We've simply tried to create the kind of place we'd want to stay ourselves. And that, Victoria said with obvious satisfaction, is exactly what makes it remarkable. Charles, why don't you explain about the railroad? Charles Ashford opened his leather portfolio and produced a detailed map that showed existing and proposed rail lines throughout the Montana Territory. The Denver and Rio Grande is planning a significant expansion into Montana, he began, with a terminus planned for a new town about 15 miles from here. The railroad needs partnership with established hospitality providers to make the route attractive to passengers. Harrison Webb leaned forward, his finger tracing the proposed route on the map. We're not just talking about a simple rail connection, Mrs. Mackenzie. We're envisioning a complete travel experience. Luxury rail cars bringing visitors directly to premier mountain destinations, with accommodations and activities that rival anything available in the established resort areas back east. Rose studied the map, her mind immediately beginning to calculate the implications. A railroad connection would transform their business entirely, bringing in hundreds of potential guests while also fundamentally changing the character of Silver Creek itself. What exactly are you proposing? Jack asked, his tone carefully neutral. Partnership, Victoria said, echoing the word that had launched their original collaboration. The railroad wants to feature the Rose Mountain Grand Hotel as the crown jewel of their Montana route. In exchange, they'll build a private spur line directly to your property and provide guaranteed passenger traffic. And I, Catherine Morrison added, would like to document the entire process for Harper's Bazaar. The story of a woman who built a hospitality empire in the wilderness is exactly the kind of inspiring narrative our readers are hungry for. Rose felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanied major decisions. The opportunity was enormous. National recognition, guaranteed business, connection to the broader transportation networks that were transforming the American West. But it would also mean even more dramatic changes to their quiet mountain community. "We need to see detailed proposals," Jack said diplomatically. "This would affect not just our business, but the entire character of Silver Creek." "Of course," Harrison Webb agreed. "I have complete financial projections and construction timelines in my rooms. Perhaps we could discuss specifics over dinner this evening." As the group made plans for the evening's business discussion, Rose found herself thinking about the morning's letter from the governor's office. Two major opportunities in a single day, both offering paths to influence and recognition she'd never imagined possible. It felt like the universe was presenting her with choices that would determine not just her future, but the kind of legacy she and Jack would leave behind. That evening's dinner was held in the hotel's private dining room, the same space where Rose and Jack had first met with the Ashfords 4 years earlier. But where that original meeting had been about survival and protection, this conversation was about expansion and influence on a scale that still left Rose slightly breathless. "The numbers are impressive," Jack admitted, studying the financial projections Harrison Webb had provided. "But I'm concerned about the environmental impact. A railroad spur would require significant construction through pristine wilderness." "That's exactly why we need your input," Webb replied. "The Denver and Rio Grande has learned from past mistakes. We're committed to construction methods that minimize environmental disruption and preserve the natural beauty that draws visitors in the first place." Catherine Morrison looked up from the notes she'd been taking throughout dinner. "Mrs. McKenzie, you've been rather quiet this evening. What are your thoughts about the railroad partnership?" Rose set down her wine glass, choosing her words carefully. "I think it represents an incredible opportunity, but also a tremendous responsibility. Everything we've built here has been about creating something sustainable, economically, environmentally, and socially. Any expansion would need to honor those same principles." "Which brings me to another possibility," Victoria said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Charles and I have been discussing this proposal in the context of a much larger vision. What if the Rose Mountain Grand Hotel became the flagship property of a new kind of hospitality company?" "What do you mean?" Rose asked. Charles spread out additional papers showing properties throughout the Mountain West, locations in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah where similar luxury hotels could be established. "We're envisioning a network of premium mountain resorts, each maintaining local character while offering consistently exceptional service. The railroad partnership would connect them all, creating a complete luxury travel experience." The scope of what they were discussing was staggering. Rose tried to imagine herself overseeing multiple properties, training staff across several states, developing standards and practices that would maintain quality while allowing for regional differences. "You'd want us to manage the entire network?" Jack asked. "We'd want you to create it," Victoria corrected. "Your vision, your standards, your approach to hospitality. Charles and I would provide the capital and handle the business logistics, but the creative direction would be entirely yours." Rose felt her heart racing with the magnitude of the opportunity. It was everything she'd never dared to dream. A chance to influence an entire industry, to create employment and economic opportunity across the Mountain West, to establish standards that prioritized both excellence and sustainability. "There's something else," Catherine Morrison said, glancing between Rose and Jack with obvious excitement. "Harper's Bazaar would like to chronicle the entire process. Not just one article, but a regular series following the development of the resort network. Mrs. McKenzie would become the public face of a new kind of businesswoman, one who builds empire while maintaining principles." The evening concluded with agreements to continue discussions over the following days, giving Rose and Jack time to process the various proposals and their implications. As their guests retired to their rooms, Rose and Jack found themselves alone on the hotel's veranda, surrounded by the quiet beauty of their mountain sanctuary. "What do you think?" Jack asked, the question that had become their standard way of processing major decisions together. "I think," Rose said slowly, "that 4 years ago I was afraid to dream about having a roof over my head and enough food to eat. Now I'm being asked to help shape an entire industry. Jack's arm came around her waist, pulling her close against his side. You've earned every opportunity being offered to you, Rose. The question is whether you want them. Rose leaned into her husband's warmth, thinking about all the paths her life might take from this moment. The governorship commission, the railroad partnership, the national magazine exposure, the multi-state resort network. Each represented possibilities she'd never imagined for herself. What do you want? She asked Jack. All of these opportunities would change our life dramatically. We might be traveling constantly, managing properties across multiple states, dealing with levels of publicity and scrutiny we've never experienced. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the star-scattered sky above the mountains. What I want, he said finally, is to build something lasting with the woman I love. Whether that's this single hotel or a network of dozens doesn't matter to me. What matters is that we do it together, that we stay true to the principles that brought us this far. Rose felt tears prick her eyes at the simple certainty in his voice. After 4 years of marriage, Jack still had the ability to ground her, to remind her of what truly mattered beneath all the business opportunities and public recognition. I love you, she said softly. I love you too, Jack replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. So what's our answer going to be? Rose thought about the letter from the governor's office, about Catherine Morrison's offer to document their story for a national audience, about Victoria and Charles's vision of a hospitality empire spanning the Mountain West. All of it was tempting. All of it represented validation and success beyond anything she'd dreamed possible. But what mattered most was the life she and Jack had built together, the community they'd helped create in Silver Creek, the legacy of love and partnership they were establishing one day at a time. I think, Rose said, we say yes to the things that align with our values, and let us keep building something meaningful together. The governor's commission, definitely. That's about serving our community and our state. Catherine's articles, if they focus on the business principles rather than personal details. The railroad partnership, if we can maintain control over how development happens. And the resort network? Rose smiled, feeling excitement bubble up in her chest as the vision crystallized in her mind. Yes to that too, but on our terms. We create something that proves business can be successful while being responsible. We show that you can build an empire without losing your soul. Jack's answer was a kiss that tasted of promises and possibility, of shared dreams and unwavering partnership. As they stood together on the veranda of the hotel they'd built with their own hands and hearts, Rose felt the future spreading out before them like an uncharted territory full of infinite potential. 5 years later, on a warm June evening in 1893, Rose stood in the nursery Jack had crafted in their private quarters, watching their 2-year-old daughter Margaret sleep peacefully in the rocking chair he'd made before she was born. The room was everything a child could want. Hand-carved toys scattered across polished floors, children's books lining shelves designed to grow with their daughter, windows positioned to catch the morning light and frame the mountain views that would shape her understanding of home. She's beautiful, Jack murmured from the doorway, his voice soft with the wonder that still overcame him whenever he looked at their daughter. Rose smiled, straightening the quilt her mother-in-law had sent from Missouri, made from fabric that told the story of 3 generations of Mackenzie women. Margaret Rose Mackenzie was indeed beautiful, with Jack's dark hair and Rose's green eyes. But more than that, she was loved with a completeness that had transformed both her parents in ways they were still discovering. The Denver hotel is officially booked solid through Christmas, Rose said quietly, settling into the chair beside their daughter's crib. Victoria says it's the most successful opening season they've ever had. The Rose Mountain Resort Network now included 5 properties across 4 states, each designed according to the principles Rose and Jack had established. Luxury accommodations that honored local culture and environment, employment practices that prioritized community development, and operational standards that proved profitability and responsibility could go hand in hand. And the magazine article? Jack asked, settling into the matching chair he'd crafted for late-night vigils when Margaret was teething or restless. Catherine says it'll be the cover story for Harper's Bazaar's Christmas issue, Rose replied with satisfaction. The headline is Building Empire with Heart, How One Woman Revolutionized Western Hospitality. It was everything Rose had never known she wanted: national recognition, business success that stretched across multiple states, the satisfaction of having created something that employed hundreds of people and brought prosperity to dozens of communities. But none of it compared to the quiet joy of sitting in the nursery Jack had built, watching their daughter sleep while discussing the day's business with the man who'd made it all possible. "Any regrets?" Jack asked, echoing the question he'd posed on their wedding night 5 years earlier. Rose considered the question seriously, thinking of all the paths her life might have taken, all the different choices that had led her to this moment of perfect contentment. She thought of the frightened girl who'd accepted his original proposition, the desperate woman who'd agreed to marriage for protection, the uncertain bride who'd worried she wasn't worthy of the love he offered. "Only one," she said finally, the same answer she'd given him years ago. Jack's eyebrows rose in surprise. "What's that?" Rose looked across the nursery at her husband, at the gentle giant who'd walked into her life and transformed it beyond recognition, not by changing who she was, but by helping her become who she was always meant to be. "That it took me so long to believe I deserved this happiness," she said softly. Jack's smile was warm and sure, full of the love that had sustained them through challenges and celebrated with them through triumphs. "We found each other when we needed to," he said, repeating the words he'd spoken on their wedding night. "That's what matters." As Rose looked around the nursery they'd created for their daughter, surrounded by evidence of the life and love and legacy they'd built together, she knew Jack was right. The timing had been perfect, bringing them together exactly when they were ready to build something lasting and beautiful and true. Outside their window, the lights of Silver Creek twinkled in the mountain darkness, and in the distance, the whistle of the evening train carried the promise of new guests, new opportunities, new chapters in the story they were writing together. But here in the nursery, in the quiet sanctuary of their love, Rose Mackenzie felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who had found her place in the world and filled it completely. Jack Mackenzie had indeed made her forget every man before him, not by erasing her past, but by giving her a future so bright and beautiful it made everything else fade into insignificance. And as she watched their daughter sleep in the rocking chair he'd crafted with his own loving hands, Rose knew their story was just beginning.